Antiseptic masks a lot of things, but it never fully covers the smell of fear. Claire knew this better than anyone in County General. She spent her nights taping IVs and nodding at hysterical patients, pretending she hadn't spent her 20s stitching together torn limbs in places that didn't exist on any map. Fluorescent lights in a hospital don't buzz. They hum. It's a low, insistent vibration that burrows behind your eyes around 3 in the morning and stays there until dawn. Claire leaned against the laminate counter of the nurse's station, a lukewarm cup of vending machine coffee warming her palms. The liquid tasted like burnt copper and regret, but she drank it anyway. It was a familiar kind of awful. She watched the ER floor with half-lidded eyes. A Tuesday night. The waiting room was a stagnant puddle of humanity, a sprained ankle, a suspected food poisoning, 2 drunks sleeping off cheap whiskey in the plastic chairs near the sliding doors. Nothing loud, nothing that required her pulse to rise above a resting 60 beats per minute. That was exactly how she liked it. "You're glaring at the monitors again, Claire," a voice chirped to her left. It was Sarah, a fresh-faced RN barely 6 months out of nursing school. Sarah wore scrubs with cartoon bears on them and still believed in holding patients' hands while they cried. Claire found her exhausting. Not because Sarah was bad at her job, but because she cared too much. Empathy was a sponge, and in an ER, you wrung yourself out dry by year 2, or you drowned. "Just reading the vitals," Claire said, her voice flat, gravelly from disuse. "Bed 4's pressure is dropping a little. I'm going to go check his fluids." Sarah scurried off the rubber soles of her pristine white sneakers, squeaking against the linoleum. Claire didn't move. Bed 4 was a minor laceration from a bar fight. The guy was just dehydrating himself by sweating off alcohol. He didn't need fluids. He needed to stop drinking. But she let Sarah go. The kid needed to feel useful. Claire adjusted the collar of her oversized navy scrubs. She always bought them a size too large. They swallowed her frame, hiding the rigid posture and the thick, jagged scar that slashed across her left collarbone, a souvenir from a piece of shrapnel in a valley she never bothered to learn the name of. To the rest of the staff at County General, Claire was just part of the furniture. The quiet, slightly frumpy night shift nurse who never went to the Friday night happy hours, never gossiped about the attending physicians, and always took the worst shifts without a single complaint. She was 42, though the gray streaks heavily dusting her dark, messy bun made her look older. She liked looking older. It made people look right past her. The sliding doors at the ambulance bay hissed open, shattering the quiet. "Incoming level 1 trauma," a paramedic shouted, pushing a gurney through the entryway. The wheels clattered violently over the metal threshold. Instantly, the stagnant puddle of the ER rippled into organized chaos. Dr. Collins, a third-year resident who still sweated through his scrubs when things got messy, jogged out of the break room, a half-eaten bagel still in his hand. "What do we have?" Collins asked, tossing the bagel into a biohazard bin by mistake. "Motorcycle versus semi-truck," the paramedic rattled off breathless. "Male 20s, right leg is crushed, massive hemorrhage. We threw a tourniquet on it high and tight, but he's hypotensive. Pressure is fading fast." Claire stayed by the counter for a fraction of a second, cataloging the sensory inputs. The sharp tang of iron hit her nose, first slicing through the bleach. Then the smell of burnt rubber and raw asphalt clinging to the patient's torn clothes. She heard the wet, ragged sound of his breathing. She walked over. She didn't run. Running caused panic, and panic killed people. By the time she reached the trauma bay, Sarah was already there, her hands shaking as she fumbled with a plastic IV catheter. The patient was thrashing his skin the color of dirty chalk. I can't find a vein," Sarah stammered, her voice pitching an octave higher. "He's clamped down. His veins are flat." "Move," Claire said. It wasn't a request. She bumped Sarah out of the way with her hip. She didn't bother looking for a vein in the crook of the arm. Waste of time on a guy bleeding out. She grabbed a 16-gauge needle, her bare fingers slipping slightly on the slick packaging. She didn't put on gloves. There was no time, and frankly, she didn't care. She pressed her thumb hard against the patient's external jugular. A faint, pathetic flutter met her skin. "Doc, he needs fluids now, forget the arms," Claire muttered, not looking at Collins. Without waiting for his approval, she jammed the needle into the neck. A flash of dark, deoxygenated blood popped into the chamber. She secured it with a strip of tape she'd ripped off with her teeth. "I'm in. Hang 2 units of O-neg, squeeze them in." Collins stared at her, blinking rapidly. I was going to order a central line." "Too slow," Claire said, stepping back into the shadows of the room, wiping a smear of blood off her wrist onto her scrub pants. "He'd be dead before you found the kit." She watched as the rest of the team swarmed the bed, shouting orders, cutting away the ruined denim of the man's jeans. The raw meat of the crushed leg was exposed. It was a mess. Splintered bone, shredded muscle fat deposits, looking like yellow cottage cheese. Sarah gagged quietly into her mask. Claire felt absolutely nothing. It was just plumbing. Tubes and pipes. You plug the leaks, you fill the tank, you keep the pump running. She watched the monitor as the blood pressure began to stabilize. The crisis was over. The surgeons would take him upstairs, put him to sleep, and play mechanics for 6 hours. She turned and walked out of the trauma bay, the squeak of her clogs the only sound she made. She went back to the nurse's station, poured the rest of her cold metallic coffee down the sink, and started a new pot. "That was a lucky stick, Claire," Dr. Collins said a few minutes later, leaning against the counter. He was trying to sound authoritative, but his hands were still shaking slightly. "Yeah," Claire said, not looking at him. She was focused on the rhythm of the coffee dripping into the glass carafe. Lucky. She didn't tell him that she had learned to hit a jugular vein in the back of a pitch-black Black Hawk helicopter that was banking hard to avoid anti-aircraft fire over a hostile border. She didn't tell him that a crushed leg from a motorcycle was clean compared to a leg blown apart by an improvised explosive device, where dirt and shrapnel and pieces of the guy's best friend were mixed into the wound. She just nodded, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and went back to being invisible. By 5:45 a.m., the ER was a graveyard of discarded medical supplies. The trash cans overflowed with blue nitrile gloves, empty saline wrappers, and blood-soaked gauze. The smell of the hospital had shifted from active trauma to the tired, sour scent of exhausted bodies and cooling floor wax. Claire was sitting at the charting computer in the corner, her fingers mechanically clicking through the mandatory electronic forms. Click. Patient denies allergies. Click. Vitals stable at discharge. Click. The rain had started outside. She could hear it lashing against the glass of the sliding doors, a heavy rhythmic drumming that almost covered the hum of the fluorescent lights. Almost. She was 20 minutes away from clocking out. 20 minutes from her rusted Subaru, her empty apartment, and a glass of cheap bourbon before bed. The heavy metallic thud of the sliding doors locking into the open position made her pause. It wasn't the sound of the doors themselves. It was the footsteps that followed. In a hospital, you learn to identify people by their walk. Doctors walk with a hurried, arrogant clip. Nurses shuffle heavy on their heels from fatigue. Patients drag their feet. These footsteps were different, deliberate, synchronized. Heavy rubber soles hitting the linoleum with a measured predatory weight. Thud, thud, thud. Claire's fingers stopped over the keyboard. The tiny hairs on the back of her neck stood up, rubbing uncomfortably against the collar of her scrub top. Her stomach dropped, not a flutter of anxiety, but a cold, heavy stone of deep, instinctual warning. She turned her head just an inch, keeping her profile to the room. 4 men had walked into the triage area. They didn't look like patients. They didn't look like cops. They wore civilian clothes, faded denim, dark weatherproof jackets, heavy boots, but the clothes hung on them with an aggressive stiffness. Claire's eyes tracked them with clinical precision. The man in front was tall, broad-shouldered, with a dark, tightly trimmed beard. He stood perfectly still, letting his eyes sweep the room, left to right, checking the corners, checking the exits, assessing the security guard, a retired mall cop who was currently asleep over a crossword puzzle, dismissing the threat. The man to his right was leaner, his face heavily mapped with shiny pink burn tissue that crawled up the left side of his neck and disappeared into his hairline. He was missing the top half of his left ear. The 2 in the back stood at a slight angle, blading their bodies away from the main seating area, hands resting casually near their waistbands. They were a tactical element. They had fallen into a defensive formation the second they cleared the fatal funnel of the doorway. Claire felt a sudden suffocating tightness in her chest. She tasted dust. Just for a second. The dry, chalky taste of pulverized concrete and cordite. She blinked hard, forcing the phantom taste away, focusing on the tacky feel of the keyboard under her fingers. "They aren't here for you," she told herself. "You're a ghost. You've been a ghost for 6 years." The tall man approached the triage glass. Sarah was sitting behind it, yawning. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, her voice cracking slightly under the intense weight of the man's stare. "We're looking for someone," the man said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like dragging a heavy stone across gravel. "A nurse, works the night shift." Sarah blinked. We have a lot of nurses. Are you family? I need a patient name." "We're not here for a patient," the burn-scarred man said, stepping up to the glass. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, flicked over Sarah. "Her name is Claire Donnelly." Claire's hand slipped off the mouse. The plastic clattered against the desk. The sound was microscopic, completely swallowed by the ambient noise of the ER. But the tall man's head snapped toward the corner. He bypassed the triage glass, bypassed the waiting chairs, his eyes locking onto the hunched figure in the oversized navy scrubs. He didn't yell. He didn't smile. He just stared. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. Every instinct she had forged in places where hesitation meant a closed casket funeral screamed at her to move. To duck behind the counter, slip out the biohazard exit, and vanish into the rain. She could disappear. She knew how, but her legs felt like lead. The 4 men broke their formation. They walked past the authorized personnel only sign without breaking stride. "Hey, you can't go back there," Sarah yelled, standing up her cartoon bear scrubs, looking absurd against the heavy, violent gravity the men brought into the room. Dr. Collins stepped out of a patient room, looking annoyed. "Excuse me, gentlemen, this is a restricted..." The tall man didn't even look at Collins. He just kept walking, closing the distance to the charting corner. Collins took one look at the dead, flat expression in the man's eyes and stepped backward, pressing his spine against the wall. Claire slowly stood up. Her knees popped. The ache in her joints felt suddenly profound. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, hugging herself, trying to shrink inside the baggy fabric. She felt exposed, stripped raw under the buzzing neon. They stopped 5 feet from her. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. The burn-scarred man had a slight tremor in his left hand. One of the men in the back shifted his weight, and Claire heard the unmistakable muffled click whine of a high-end prosthetic knee. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody spoke. The air in the ER seemed to thicken, heavy, and unbreathable. The tall man swallowed hard. The muscle in his jaw jumped. He looked at Claire, at her messy hair, her tired eyes, the cheap pen tucked behind her ear. "You're hard to find, Doc," he said softly. Claire closed her eyes. The word hit her like a physical blow. Not nurse. Not Claire. Doc. "I wasn't trying to be found, Wyatt," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, shaking just a fraction. Behind Wyatt, the burn-scarred man let out a long, shuddering breath. "We didn't know if you made it out of the valley. Command said you were dusted off after the compound fell, but your file got locked down, classified." "It got locked down for a reason, Briggs," Claire said, opening her eyes. She looked at his neck. She remembered the smell of his flesh cooking. She remembered pressing her bare hands into the burning meat of his shoulder, screaming for covering fire, while she dumped a packet of Quick-Clot into the crater of his collarbone. She looked at the man with the prosthetic. "Sullivan, you're walking." Sullivan offered a tight, crooked smile. "Yeah, Doc, only took 3 years of rehab and a titanium strut, but I'm walking." The rest of the ER had gone completely silent. The low murmur of patients, the squeak of shoes, the hum of the monitors, it all seemed to fade into the background. Sarah was standing frozen behind the triage desk, her mouth slightly open. Dr. Collins was staring at Claire as if she had suddenly grown a second head. They were looking at the invisible woman, the coffee-drinking, chart-clicking ghost of the night shift, currently surrounded by 4 heavily scarred, incredibly dangerous men who were looking at her like she was the only fixed point in their universe. "Why are you here, Wyatt?" Claire asked, her voice cracking. She didn't want them here. She didn't want the gratitude. Gratitude meant dragging the worst day of their lives out into the light. Gratitude meant remembering the mud, the noise, the copper tang of blood soaking through her uniform. Gratitude meant remembering the ones she couldn't fix. Wyatt took a half step forward. He reached into his heavy canvas jacket. Claire saw Collins flinch out of the corner of her eye, anticipating a weapon. Instead, Wyatt pulled out a small, worn piece of fabric. It was a faded olive drab patch. A medic's cross frayed at the edges, stained with a dark, rusted brown color that never washed out of nylon. "We came to say thank you," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, thick with an emotion that threatened to break the stony facade of his face. "And to give this back." He held it out to her. Claire stared at the patch. Her hand stayed locked across her chest. Her breath hitched, catching painfully in her throat. She could smell the dust again. She could hear the deafening, rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of rotor blades. "I don't want it," she said, her voice barely audible. "Wyatt, please, put it away." "You dropped it in the mud, Doc." Wyatt insisted, his hand remaining steady, offering the blood-stained fabric. "Right before you dragged me 50 yards under heavy fire. You left it behind." "I left a lot of things behind," Claire said fiercely, a sudden desperate anger rising in her chest. She glared at him, her eyes burning. That was the point. Silence stretched tight enough to snap. The cardiac monitor in bed 3 beeped a hollow rhythmic metronome that mocked the sudden violent irregularity in Claire's own chest. She looked from the dirty nylon patch to Wyatt's calloused hand, then up to his eyes. They were dark, entirely stripped of the calculated predatory assessment they had carried into the room just moments before. They were just tired, like hers. "I don't want it," Claire repeated, the gravel in her voice thickening. She took a half step backward, her shoulder blades bumping against the cold edge of the charting station. "Take it and get out, Wyatt. You shouldn't be here." Dr. Collins, having finally located his misplaced courage, pushed himself off the wall. "Listen, you guys need to leave. This is a secure area, and you are harassing my staff. I'm calling security." Wyatt didn't even turn his head. He just shifted his gaze a fraction of an inch, locking onto Collins in his peripheral vision. "Your security guard is asleep at a desk with a half-finished crossword. Sit down, Doc. This doesn't concern you. I am the attending physician on this floor, and I—" "Shut up, Collins," Claire snapped. The harshness in her tone cracked like a whip across the room. Collins snapped his mouth shut, his pale face flushing a deep, angry red. He looked at Claire, really looked at her perhaps for the first time since she transferred to his shift 6 months ago. The frumpy, quiet nurse in the oversized scrubs was gone. The woman standing by the counter had a rigid spine, her jaw set like poured concrete, radiating an intense, suppressed hostility that made the hairs on his arms stand up. "You dragged me," Wyatt said, turning his focus back to Claire. His voice dropped into a ragged register meant only for her. "My femur was in pieces. My comms were gone. I was bleeding out in a muddy ditch, Doc. You came back." Claire squeezed her eyes shut. The sterile smell of the ER vanished. Suddenly, she was inhaling burning diesel and wet wool. She could feel the grit of pulverized drywall grinding between her back teeth. She felt the dead weight of a grown man encased in heavy body armor dragging behind her, the strap of his tactical vest digging a bruised trench into her palm. She heard the terrifying supersonic crack hiss of rounds passing inches from her ears. "I had to," she whispered, her eyes still tightly closed. "It was my job." "You went outside the wire." Briggs interjected, his boots squeaking softly against the linoleum as he took a step forward. The burn scar on his neck pulled tight, rendering his expression asymmetrical. "Command ordered a full retreat. You ignored a direct order from the lieutenant. You ran 50 yards into an active kill zone with nothing but a sidearm and a trauma kit." "I didn't get Hayes," Claire said. The words tore out of her throat before she could stop them. They tasted like ash. She opened her eyes, glaring at the 4 men, her chest heaving under the baggy navy fabric. Her carefully constructed apathy, the numb shell she had spent 6 years building in this fluorescent purgatory, was fracturing. "I didn't get him," she repeated, her voice shaking violently now. She pointed a trembling finger at the stained patch in Wyatt's hand. "That stain on the corner. That's Hayes. His carotid was severed by shrapnel. I had my fingers clamped inside his neck for 20 minutes, waiting for evac that never came. He drowned in his own blood while I watched. So don't come in here and hand me that piece of trash like it's a medal. It's a failure." The ER was dead silent. Sarah, the young nurse, had a hand clamped over her mouth, tears pooling in her wide eyes. Sullivan, the man with the prosthetic leg, shifted his weight. The metal knee whined softly. He stepped past Briggs, closing the distance to the counter. He was shorter than the others, with a gentle, weathered face that seemed out of place among the heavily scarred men. Hayes was dead before he hit the ground. Doc, Sullivan said quietly, you know that. Medically, you know that. I could have. You couldn't, Sullivan interrupted, his voice firm, grounding her. You kept him comfortable. You stayed with him so he didn't die alone in the dirt. And then you turned around and hauled Wyatt out of the ditch. You put a tourniquet on my leg while we were taking mortar fire. You stabilized Briggs's burns. Sullivan reached out and gently pushed Wyatt's hand down. He looked at Claire, his eyes shining under the harsh hospital lights. We went to Landstuhl, Sullivan continued. Then Walter Reed, surgeries, rehab, nightmares. We survived, Doc, but we didn't live, not for a long time. We spent years carrying the ghosts around just like you. Claire stared at his chest, refusing to meet his eyes. Her hands were buried deep in her scrub pockets, fists clenched so tight her fingernails were cutting half moons into her palms. Why now? She asked, her voice cracking into a whisper. Why drag this up now? Because we're finally done, Wyatt said. He placed the faded, blood-stained patch gently on the cold laminate counter. It looked absurdly small, sitting next to a plastic container of sanitized pens and a stack of discharge forms. We're finally figuring out how to live in the quiet, but we couldn't move on until we found the person who gave us the chance to try. Wyatt took a step back, realigning himself with Briggs and Sullivan. The tactical formation was gone. They were just four broken men standing in a suburban hospital, looking at the woman who had pulled them out of hell. We don't expect you to wear it, Wyatt said softly. Burn it, throw it away, but it belongs to you. You earned it in the mud. Don't let it be a ghost anymore. Nobody saluted. There were no dramatic embraces, no cinematic music swelling in the background. The real world doesn't work like that. Trauma doesn't evaporate because someone says, thank you. Wyatt gave a single stiff nod. Briggs tapped his heart twice with 2 fingers. Sullivan offered a small, crooked smile. Then they turned around and walked out. Claire watched them go. The heavy thud, thud, thud of their boots retreated across the waiting room. The automatic doors hissed open, letting in a gust of cold, rain-scented air, and then slid shut with a definitive mechanical clunk. They were gone. The ER remained frozen for another 10 seconds. Claire, Sarah whispered from the triage desk. Her voice was trembling. Were you in the military? Claire slowly uncurled her fists inside her pockets. Her knuckles ached. She looked at the young nurse, at the cartoon bears on her scrubs, at the naive, wide-eyed empathy that Claire had spent months despising. For the first time, Claire didn't feel annoyed by it. She just felt old. A long time ago, Sarah, Claire said, her voice flat, returning to its usual gravelly baseline. But what they said, you saved them. You're a hero. There are no heroes in a trauma bay, Claire said, her eyes drifting to the patch on the counter. Just plumbers trying to stop the leaks. She reached out and picked up the patch. The rough nylon scraped against her fingertips. It felt incredibly heavy, as if it contained the density of lead. She didn't look at it closely. She didn't want to see the rusted brown stain on the corner. She shoved it deep into her pocket, letting it sink to the bottom. Dr. Collins cleared his throat. He looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. He had spent 6 months treating Claire like an uneducated lackey, delegating the grunt work while he paraded his medical degree. Now he was looking at a woman who had performed field surgery under heavy artillery fire. Claire, Collins started, pausing to find the words. If you need to take the rest of the shift off, I can cover the charting. Claire looked at the clock on the wall. 6:42 a.m., 18 minutes left. "I'm fine, doctor," she said, sitting heavily back down in her rolling chair. She pulled the keyboard toward her. "Bed 4 still needs his discharge paperwork signed. His pressure stabilized an hour ago. You should go check his laceration before the day shift gets here." Collins blinked clearly out of his depth. "Right. Yes. Bed 4. He turned and scurried down the hall, eager to escape the heavy gravity that still lingered around the nurse's station. Claire stared at the computer screen. The blue light washed over her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes. She placed her fingers on the keys. Click. Patient resting comfortably. Click. Vitals stable. She finished the paperwork. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. She just worked, letting the familiar mundane rhythm of the hospital anchor her back to reality. At exactly 7 a.m., the day shift arrived. The doors hissed open repeatedly, bringing in nurses smelling of fresh rain, expensive shampoo, and strong coffee. They chattered loudly about weekend plans and traffic on the interstate. The stagnant, haunted quiet of the night shift evaporated. Claire stood up, grabbed her heavy wool coat from the break room locker, and clocked out. She walked out into the gray morning. The rain had slowed to a persistent icy drizzle. The cold bit into her cheeks, but it felt good. It felt clean. She walked to her rusted Subaru, parked under a flickering sodium streetlight. She unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut, sealing herself inside the small, damp cabin. The engine whined in protest before finally turning over a rough, uneven idle that vibrated up through the steering column into her hands. Claire sat there for a long time, watching the wipers drag back and forth across the windshield, smearing the rain into blurry streaks. She reached into her scrub pocket. Her fingers brushed against the patch. Slowly, she pulled it out. In the harsh gray light of the morning, it looked exactly like what it was, a dirty, frayed piece of fabric. But as she rubbed her thumb across the embroidered cross, the texture felt different. The sharp edges of the memory didn't cut quite as deep. She didn't feel the suffocating weight of the valley. She didn't taste the dust. She thought about Sullivan walking. She thought about Briggs alive, despite the burns. She thought about Wyatt standing tall instead of bleeding out in the mud. She reached forward and placed the patch on the dashboard right above the steering wheel. It sat there, a small, ugly testament to a past she couldn't erase. Claire put the car in drive and pulled out of the parking lot. She still wanted that glass of cheap bourbon. She still had nightmares waiting for her when she finally closed her eyes. But as she drove through the wet gray streets of the city, glancing occasionally at the piece of nylon on her dash, the hum of the fluorescent lights finally faded from her head. It was quiet, and for the first time in 6 years, she let it be. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and share it with someone who appreciates raw, grounded storytelling. We all carry invisible scars, and sometimes the quietest people have survived the loudest battles. Subscribe to the channel for more gripping, character-driven narratives that dive deep into the human condition without the cliché fluff. Drop a comment below. What did you think of Claire's reaction? Let's get a discussion going in the comments section.